And then we both kind of laid down. And then she started freaking out again. And she went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, came in the bedroom. I don't know what she was doing with it at first, and she was just kind of freaking out. I tried to take it from her, and then she ran out of the living room. And I don't know how much of this next part is true or false, but I remember grabbing the baseball bat and hitting her with it. Okay, I'm going to be honest. I don't know what happened from the time that we went to bed to the time that I hit her with the baseball bat. We came inside and we were talking. We lay down, we were still talking. And the next thing I remember is hitting her with a baseball bat.
A rainy spring night in Davenport, Iowa, seemed like just another evening, until a routine car crash call led to a chilling revelation. Deputies arrived to find a driver, intoxicated and confused, with little memory of how he ended up in the wreck. But as his foggy mind began to clear, what he recalled would unravel a dark, twisted tale. A case that started as an accident would soon uncover something far more sinister. This is a shocking story of Taylor Escontrias. If you want to hear more jaw-dropping true crime stories, make sure to subscribe, and stay with us. It was 1:47 a.m. on March 13th when Lieutenant Thomas Leonard arrived at the scene of the crash. The silver Impala had collided with a concrete median and slammed into a light pole. The driver, Christopher Beall, was disoriented and reeked of alcohol. His eyes were unfocused and his speech was slurred. He couldn't remember much, not even where he was or how he ended up in a wreck. It was a scene that, on the surface, looked like another typical DUI accident. But there was something more. As the officers began to check on him, something caught their attention. A knife lying dangerously close to his feet. Chris couldn't explain where he'd been or where he was going.
And its driver.
Buddy, can you look at me? Are you alright?
Yeah.
You're in an accident. Do you know that?
No.
Where were you heading to? Do you know where you're at all or anything?
Yeah, the
Wait, where were you heading, you think?
The auditorium.
The auditorium?
Yeah.
What's your name?
Chris Ian.
Chris?
Ian? Chris Levy.
Oh, okay.
His responses were vague and disconnected. His confusion was only deepened by a small injury on his side, which he claimed was nothing serious. But was it really? Was this just an accident? Or was there more to the story that Chris wasn't willing to say? After the accident, deputies made their way to Chris Beall's apartment, the Crestview Apartments in Davenport, to check on his girlfriend, Taylor Escontrias. They arrived at her door, but everything seemed quiet. No signs of trouble. The apartment was locked, and the phone number listed for Taylor went unanswered. They knocked, but there was no response. At first, everything appeared normal, too normal. There were no signs of forced entry or any immediate reason for concern. But something wasn't right. Chris had been taken to the hospital for treatment after the crash, and when the deputies returned there to continue their investigation, Chris's behavior began to shift. He started asking strange, urgent questions. His concern seemed to grow with every passing moment. He wanted to know if Taylor was okay. In fact, he insisted that the deputies return to the apartment immediately to check on her, almost as if he feared something terrible had happened. Was his sudden concern for Taylor's safety genuine? Or was there more to his anxiety than he was willing to admit? It wasn't just a passing thought. Chris began to describe disturbing images that flashed through his mind, flashes of violence, of what he might have done to Taylor. His voice was shaky, filled with a sense of dread, and his words seemed to get more frantic as he spoke. "I think I did something," he said, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. Could it be that his memories were starting to resurface? Could he have been responsible for the horror that had taken place? Chris's fragmented recollections raised more questions than answers. Had the accident really been an accident? Or had something far more sinister happened in that apartment? As he urged the deputies to check on Taylor, it became increasingly clear Chris wasn't just worried about her. He seemed to be trying to make sure that no one would find out what he might have done. After Chris's unusual request, the deputies returned to the Crestview apartments. This time, there was no hesitation. When they reached Taylor's apartment, they found the door unexpectedly unlocked. It wasn't a sign of an emergency, but it definitely wasn't normal. The door opened with ease, but what lay just beyond it was a scene no one could have anticipated. There, in the doorway, was Taylor. The young mother was lifeless, her body a gruesome sight. The brutality of what had happened inside that apartment became painfully clear. The bloodstains on the floor, the obvious signs of a violent struggle, everything pointed to a horrifying attack. Taylor had been struck repeatedly with a baseball bat, stabbed with a knife, and even wounded with a screwdriver. Nearly 60 injuries in total. The evidence told a chilling story. The attack wasn't quick. It was drawn out. It had moved through various parts of the apartment. The living room, the kitchen, and finally, the hallway where Taylor's body was found, crumpled in the doorway. The brutality of it all, multiple weapons used, each inflicting a different kind of pain, left no doubt that this was not a random act of violence. In the living room, a bloodied baseball bat lay discarded on the couch. In the kitchen, the tip of a screwdriver was found near the sink, abandoned in haste. And the knife, the weapon that had delivered some of the deadliest wounds, was still on the floor. But it wasn't just the weapons that were telling. It was the way the attack had been spread throughout the apartment. The signs of a struggle in different rooms, a fight that moved across the space. It wasn't a single violent moment, but rather an escalating, relentless assault. The police had already recovered the knife, but the gruesome nature of what had taken place left a lingering question. Who could have done such a thing? As deputies stood in the middle of the apartment, the pieces of this puzzle began to fit together, and the possibility that someone close to Taylor had committed this horrific act was growing harder to ignore. Taylor Escontrias was, above all else, a kind-hearted and vibrant woman. People who knew her would speak of her warmth, her laughter, and the way she made others feel special. Her friends recalled her easygoing nature, her love for life, and her ability to make a room feel brighter simply by walking into it. Taylor had an innate ability to connect with people. Her friends often describe her as the kind of person who could bring out the best in others with her sense of humor, her caring spirit, and her deep empathy. But like so many who carry deep pain beneath the surface, Taylor's life was far from perfect. Though Taylor's outer world may have seemed full of joy, her inner world was more complicated. Addiction had a grip on her life for many years. It wasn't something she ever wanted, but it was something she struggled with, tirelessly fighting against it. The addiction was an ongoing battle, one that she couldn't seem to escape no matter how hard she tried. Taylor had been in and out of rehabilitation centers, always hoping for a fresh start. At her core, she wanted to be free from the hold addiction had over her. She longed for stability to build a life for herself, but the cycle of relapse always seemed to draw her back. I end one of these rehab stints. Taylor met Christopher Beall. It was at Country Oaks, a rehabilitation facility in Buffalo, Iowa, where the two first crossed paths. They found comfort in each other's company as they navigated the tough road to sobriety. Their connection grew over time. What began as mutual support for each other's struggles turned into a deeper relationship. The shared experience of fighting addiction and the comfort they found in one another's presence soon blossomed into a romantic relationship. For Taylor, Chris became someone she thought she could lean on, someone who would understand her, someone who had walked a similar path at Beall October 2023, just months before her tragic death. The two were inseparable. They moved in together, hoping for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild their lives free from the constraints of addiction. But, as is so often the case, the road to recovery is rarely smooth. The weight of addiction, the strain of emotional turbulence, and the difficulties of maintaining sobriety were ever present. Despite their shared commitment to each other, Taylor and Chris both relapsed. After completing their rehabilitation program, they returned to drinking, a decision that would set the course for their doomed relationship. For Taylor, the relapse wasn't just about alcohol. It was a painful step backward. She had struggled so hard to get to where she was. But the pressures of life, The emotional turmoil and the difficult relationship she had with her addiction pulled her back. As the days passed, Taylor's struggles deepened. She began to withdraw from those around her, retreating into herself. The woman who had once been known for her infectious laugh and vibrant personality now seemed weighed down by something invisible, something that she couldn't shake. Taylor's family could see the change. They knew something wasn't right. Though they tried to offer their support, they knew they couldn't fix what was broken. As Taylor's emotional state deteriorated, so did her relationship with Chris. The bond they had formed in rehab was now strained by their shared struggles with alcohol. They both seemed trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape, desperately trying to hold on to something that was slipping through their fingers. The tension between them grew, but neither seemed able to break free from the toxic environment they had created together. Despite their difficulties, Taylor never lost a desire for love and connection. She still longed for a better life, for the peace she had once dreamed of, but as her emotional distress grew, so did the fear she had buried deep inside. Taylor began to fear Chris. She sensed something dark within him, something that even she couldn't quite understand but knew could be dangerous. It wasn't just the alcohol. It was a growing instability in their relationship, the mounting tension that seemed to build with every passing day and the days leading up to her tragic death. Taylor reached out to friends, seeking help. She messaged them, asking them to come to her aid. She needed to leave, needed to get away, but she didn't have a way to do so. She reached out to Michael, a close friend who had helped her before. She begged him to come pick her up, to take her away from the situation she felt trapped in. But Michael, having had a few drinks himself, couldn't come to her aid. The Uber she had looked into was too expensive, and so Taylor was left alone, stuck in situations she feared more than anything. And then, as the night wore on, Taylor's fear intensified. She sent one final, chilling message to Michael. "If I get killed, it was Chris." These words were a cry for help, a desperate attempt to make someone aware of the danger she felt in her own home. It wasn't just a passing thought. It was a warning. Taylor knew something was terribly wrong. She knew that Chris had become the source of her fear, the one person she could no longer trust. Taylor then reached out to another friend, Nick Seaman, sending him a similar message around 11 p.m. "If I get killed, it was Chris." Nick didn't see the message until the next morning, but by the time he read it, it was already too late. Taylor's life had been taken, and the person she feared most, Chris Beall, was the one responsible. The chilling words she had sent were not just a cry for help. They were a prophetic warning of the tragic fate that awaited her. Taylor's tragic last messages would become a haunting reminder of the vulnerability she faced in the final moment of her life. Her fear was palpable, her instinct telling her that something terrible was about to happen. Yet, no one could reach her in time. Those final words would haunt her family, her friends, and everyone who knew her. They would never forget the message Taylor sent out, trying to ensure someone knew the truth that if something happened to her, Chris was the one to blame. After the crash and his hospitalization, Christopher Beall was arrested and brought in for questioning. What happened next would raise more questions than it answered. Chris's memory was fragmented. He couldn't recall the details of the events leading up to the murder of Taylor. His recollections were scattered, filled with gaps that seemed to grow wider with each passing moment. First, Chris claimed he didn't remember anything beyond the time they had spent together earlier in the evening. He said that they had been talking in bed, that Taylor had been emotionally distressed. But from there, his memory failed him. He couldn't remember how things escalated, how the violence unfolded, or what exactly triggered it. His first account was vague, offering no real explanation for the chaos that had clearly taken place in their apartment. Then, as the questioning continued, Chris began to speculate. He offered a troubling theory, suggesting that he may have attacked Taylor to put her out of her misery. He spoke about her being in pain, but there was no clarity, no definitive reason why he had felt the need to take such a drastic action. His words were chilling and troubling, and as he spoke, he seemed to struggle to piece together the fragment of his own memory. Chris's inconsistent story raised immediate red flags. The police had already gathered evidence from the scene. Bloodied weapons, signs of a violent struggle spread across multiple rooms in the apartment. Yet, Chris couldn't provide any coherent explanation for the attack. Was he lying to cover his tracks? Or was he truly too intoxicated to remember what had happened that night? His shifting accounts made it difficult for anyone to discern the truth as the detectives pressed him further. Chris continued to offer up vague and conflicting accounts of the events. At one point, he admitted that he could remember little to nothing after the time they were in bed together. Yet, the evidence painted a different picture, a picture of a brutal, prolonged attack. Taylor had been assaulted with multiple weapons, and the violence had spanned across the apartment, from the living room to the kitchen, and finally to the doorway where her lifeless body was discovered. Detectives were left with one important question. Was Chris's inability to recall the details of the attack a result of intoxication, or was it a deliberate attempt to obscure the truth? His story seemed too inconsistent, too full of holes. He spoke of the attack in fragments, as if trying to piece together an event he didn't want to fully remember. But his confusion could not explain away the overwhelming evidence. In the hours of questioning, Chris's tone shifted. At times, he appeared genuinely remorseful, expressing regret and confusion about what had occurred. At other times, he seemed detached, unable to grasp the severity of his actions. His conflicting emotions only made the situation more complex. Was he showing signs of a guilty conscience, or was he simply trying to protect himself? As detectives reviewed the details of his confession, they found that Chris's version of events didn't match the physical evidence at the crime scene. His repeated claims of not remembering key moments didn't add up when compared to the bloodstains, the weapons, and the signs of a violent, drawn-out struggle throughout the apartment. The inconsistency of his story suggested that there was more to the truth than Chris was willing to admit. To the core of his confession was a chilling notion that Chris seemed to have a vague recollection of the attack. Yet he couldn't explain why it had happened. His memory was fragmented, flashes of images and emotions, but no clarity. And as the hours wore on, the question lingered. Was this man truly unaware of his actions, or was he trying to protect himself from facing the brutal reality of what he had done? Chris's conflicting confessions left the police with more doubts than answers. Was he hiding the truth, or was his mind simply too clouded by intoxication to remember the details of that night? His shifting stories raised serious questions, and the deeper the investigation went, the more the lines between truth and deception began to blur. Would the real story of what happened that night ever come to light? The day of Chris Beall's trial had finally arrived. He stood in front of a courtroom, charged with the first-degree murder of his girlfriend, Taylor Escontrias. The stakes were high, as the prosecution and defense both prepared to present their case. The prosecution, armed with a mountain of evidence, was confident that they could prove Chris's actions were deliberate and calculated. But Chris's defense team had their own strategy. They argued that Chris was so intoxicated at the time of the murder that he was unable to form the intent required for a first-degree murder conviction. The defense leaned heavily on the argument that Chris's level of intoxication rendered him incapable of understanding the severity of his actions. They presented the case that, in his blackout state, Chris didn't have the mental clarity needed to plan or carry out the murder with premeditation. This was a common defense in cases involving alcohol or drugs, but in this case, the facts were more complex. While the defense argued for diminished responsibility, the prosecution had a clear and compelling narrative. The evidence against Chris was overwhelming. Forensic experts had testified about the brutal nature of the injuries Taylor sustained: blunt force trauma, stab wounds, and injuries inflicted with a screwdriver. The coroner confirmed that the attack had been prolonged and multiple weapons had been used. A bloodied baseball bat, a knife, and a screwdriver were all recovered from the crime scene, each one a grim reminder of the violence Taylor had endured. The scene inside the apartment told a story of chaos. There were signs of struggle in several rooms, indicating that the attack had moved throughout the apartment, further supporting the claim of deliberate action. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Chris's actions that night. They argued that despite his claim of being in a blackout, Chris's decision to use 3 different weapons, moving from one to another during the attack, suggested a level of awareness and intent. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a planned and brutal assault. The physical evidence, combined with the testimony of law enforcement and forensic experts, painted a chilling portrait of what happened in that apartment. But the defense wasn't willing to let go of their claim. They continued to argue that Chris's level of intoxication should be considered as a mitigating factor in his case. They contended that while Chris had undoubtedly committed the act, He did so without full awareness of his actions. The defense argued that the combination of alcohol and the traumatic emotions of the evening led to a situation where Chris could not be held fully responsible for his actions. They asked the jury to consider whether this was an act of premeditated violence or simply a tragedy fueled by the effects of alcohol. The jury, now faced with two conflicting narratives, would have to decide whether Chris's actions were premeditated or the result of an alcohol-induced blackout. Was this a man who carefully planned the attack, or was he so intoxicated that he couldn't recall what had happened? The question of intent would be the crux of the trial, and it was up to the jury to determine whether the evidence pointed to murder in the first degree or if Chris could be found guilty of a lesser charge. As the trial continued, both sides presented their evidence. The prosecution laid out the horrific details of the crime scene, the brutal injuries inflicted on Taylor, and the multiple weapons used in the attack. The defense focused on Chris's impaired state and his lack of memory surrounding the events. But the jury was tasked with something far more complicated than simply considering whether or not Chris was intoxicated, because even if he was drunk, the evidence showed that he had still carried out a series of deliberate actions. The prosecution's case seemed clear. They had the physical evidence, the testimony, and the facts to support the claim that this was a planned, brutal murder. The defense, however, was determined to introduce doubt, arguing that Chris's actions were not the result of intent, but of a man who had lost control of himself. In the end, it would be up to the jury to decide if Chris was guilty of first-degree murder or if his intoxication was enough to mitigate his responsibility. What the jury would ultimately decide would have profound consequences, not only for Chris Beall, but for everyone who had been touched by the tragic events of that night. Would the truth behind Taylor's death be enough to convict him of first-degree murder, or would Chris's defense be enough to sway the jury toward a lesser charge? The trial was just the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice for Taylor Escontrias. The trial had been long and emotional, but the jury's decision was swift. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, they returned with a verdict that would change everything. Chris Beall was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts. Chris's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a moment of justice for Taylor, but it didn't take away the pain of her loss. For her family, especially her mother, Lisa, the verdict marked the end of one chapter. But the grief of losing Taylor would never fully fade. Lisa spoke publicly after the trial, sharing how the support from family and friends had been a source of strength during this unbearable time. It was clear that, while justice had been served, the hole left by Taylor's absence could never be filled. Taylor's family members struggled to come to terms with the fact that someone they had once welcomed into their lives, someone they had trusted, was the one who had taken their daughter's life. The pain of her loss was immeasurable, but the family found comfort in the overwhelming support they received from their community. Friends, extended family, and even strangers rallied around them, offering kind words, prayers, and emotional support. Taylor's mother, Lisa, described it as a lot of love from a lot of people, a sentiment that helped them endure the darkest days. Though the court had delivered its verdict, the emotional toll on those who loved Taylor remained. The family, while grateful for justice, knew that no sentence could bring their daughter back or erase the trauma of what had happened. But the guilty verdict was a small victory, one that ensured Chris Beall would spend the rest of his life in prison, without the chance to harm anyone else again. As the courtroom emptied and the family prepared to leave, the reality of the verdict set in. While it was a significant step toward closure, the scars left by Taylor's death would stay with them forever. They would never forget the vibrant young woman who loved to laugh, who cared deeply for those around her, and who had tragically been taken too soon. In the end, the jury had decided Chris Beall was guilty of taking Taylor Escontrias' life. Justice had been served. But for Taylor's family, their journey was far from over. Their daughter, their sister, and their friend was gone, and the void she left behind was one that would never be filled. The case of Taylor Escontrias is a tragic reminder of how addiction, domestic violence, and unchecked emotional turmoil can escalate into unspeakable acts. Though justice was served in this case, it's important to remember the lives behind the headlines. Real people with families, with futures cut short by violence. Thank you for joining us as we shared Taylor's story. We hope it serves as a reminder to cherish those around us and always look out for those in need. The tragic death of Taylor Escontrias reminds us of the destructive power of addiction and violence. It also serves as a warning how sometimes we can't see the danger lurking right in front of us. Thank you for joining us in this heartbreaking story. If you found this case compelling, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories. Your support means the world to us, and we look forward to bringing you more stories that need to be heard. Stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next one.